Yes, the name of the subject that you are going to learn is Public International Law. The moment you hear this term Public International Law, you will get a question. If there is a public international law, then is there a private international law also? Now, if there is a private international law, then what is public international law and what is private international law? Now, if there are two kinds of law, then what is the difference between public international law and private international law? Now, when you get so many of questions, that gives so much of opportunities to me. Hey guys, welcome to my legal classes. This is Ganesh Pujari, and in my today's class, I am going to explain what is public international law, what is private international law, and the differences between public and private international law. Why to waste time? Let's get into the first slide. The context is very easy. We have something by name international law, under which we have two categories or types, that is private international law and public international law. These private international laws are basically agreement between nations, and so they are also called as jus inter-gens, whereas public international laws are the laws of nations, so we are calling them as jus gentium. Now let us try understand private international law and public international law in detail. The private international laws are dealing with mostly the controversies between private entities such as people or corporations. As they are mostly dealing with controversies, they are also known as conflict of laws, and this is applicable for only those countries who have agreed to follow those laws, and mostly they are signed for the purpose of business or contract, and that is why the private international laws are playing very big role in the case of globalization. Now, if you ask me one example for private international law, there was Bhopal gas tragedy, and the plant was owned by a United States company, and this entire case was a case of private international law because this was dealt with the agreement between Indian and US laws. So that's an example for private international law. While private international laws are mostly limited to those two or more nations who have come to an agreement to follow certain laws between them for some business or individual or corporation relationship, public international law is all about the relationship between many nations, which includes the areas like treaty law, law of sea, international criminal law, the laws of war, or international humanitarian laws, or international human rights laws, refugee laws, etc. The rules of international laws are found in treaties, conventions, declarations, agreements, customs, and other sources. And the biggest example for the public international law is Kyoto Protocol, where many of the countries came together and signed for the purpose of protecting the environment. Now, the private international laws are limited to only those countries who have come together for certain objective, whereas public international law is applicable mostly the majority number of states in the world. Now, if we have learned so much, let us try understand the difference between private international law and public international law. I'm sure by now you have your own list of differences between private international law and public international law. I have brought 7 such differences, and let us try understand one by one. The first being, the private international law is limited to very few countries, maybe 2 or the limited number of nations, whereas public international laws are applying to many nations. The second difference is private international law is known as law of conflicts because it mostly deals with the controversies between individuals and organizations, whereas the public international law is known as law of nations because it is binding many of the nations in its way. The third difference is private international law is limited to individuals and organizations only, whereas the public international law is extended to states, individuals, as well as organizations. The fourth difference is the private international laws are mostly codified by the legislature of the applicable states, whereas the public international laws are mostly in the form of treaties, practices, or customs. The private international laws are mostly codified. That is one important aspect you need to remember, whereas public international law is based on treaties, practices, and customs. The fifth difference is the private international law applies to agreed parties only. Now, for example, to travel to Nepal from India, there is no passport required, or to travel from Nepal to India, there is no passport required because that is the agreement that we have with Nepal. Or the same happens with USA and Canada. There is no passport required for these two citizens to travel in each other country. That is the agreement between them. So that applies to only those parties who have agreed for such international laws, whereas public international law is applicable for the entire universe. The sixth difference is the private international law differs from state to state. It is their objective, their purpose, and they will form according to their requirement, whereas public international law remains same for all. And the last difference is private international laws are came into existence mostly for the purpose of business or individual relationship, whereas public international law is coming to existence for the purpose of peace, humanity, environment, etc. Now, when I am saying individual relationship under private international law, that can be for the purpose of divorce happened between two individuals coming from two different nations. Now, it can be applied with the private international law considering the law of both the nations and the agreement between both the nations. That's all about the differences between private international law and public international law. I hope now that you have complete clarity on what is private international law and public international law. With that, I am concluding this particular video. Thank you so much for subscribing my channel. Please like, share and comment my videos. All the very best for whatsoever purpose you are watching my channel, and thanks for watching me.